In October 401 BC, the King of Kings, Artaxerxes II, stood off against the rebel force led by his own brother, Cyrus the Younger, at the Battle of Cunaxa on the banks of the river Euphrates. The young Cyrus, just 22 years old, had amassed an army of Greek mercenaries around 14,000 strong, with which he hoped to overthrow his older brother and take the throne for himself. In response, Artaxerxes met Cyrus with a number over twice his size, perhaps as many as 40,000 strong. Heavily outnumbered, the battle turns against Cyrus, and in a last-ditch effort to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the younger brother makes a daring charge directly at Artaxerxes' camp. But Cyrus's moment of valor is suddenly cut short when he's struck with a javelin, which kills him instantly. The man who threw this javelin would go down in history as Mithridates, the man who suffered possibly the worst fate in all of history, a process known today as the boats. But how did this soldier of King Artaxerxes come to find himself subject to this gruesome fate, and what makes the boats so bad? To answer that, we need to pick up where we left off. So, Cyrus the Younger had been slain at the Battle of Cunaxa, and as we know, it was Mithridates who had struck him down. After Cyrus was killed, his rebel forces melted away, and Artaxerxes had been able to successfully put down the uprising and secure his position on the throne. Not only that, but his rival claimant was now dead for good, and he had Mithridates to thank for it. Initially, Artaxerxes was extremely pleased with Mithridates and showered him with gold and promotions for his valiant service. But all of this favour and wealth came on one condition. Mithridates was never to speak aloud that he had killed Cyrus the Younger. The honour of this great deed was to go to King Artaxerxes personally. Unfortunately for Mithridates, his discretion was not as good as his aim, and during the feast to celebrate the battle, he started drunkenly boasting that it was none other than him who had sunk the javelin into Cyrus's chest. This ran directly against the story that King Artaxerxes had told his guests, and as a result, the king was exposed as a liar who had stolen Mithridates' valour. For this act of open disobedience, and for the crime of embarrassing the crown, Mithridates was sentenced to death by Scaphism. It was, and perhaps still is, the worst execution method in history, and the process would take not minutes, not hours, not even days. Mithridates' death would take 2.5 weeks to carry out, and each moment would be pure and utter agony. At first, the whole thing actually doesn't sound that bad. In fact, some people have even gone on to call it death by milk and honey, which almost sounds appealing, but as the process unfolds, the horror comes to light. It all begins by taking a small boat and then placing the victim inside so that their hands, feet and head are able to protrude out of the sides, and then an equally sized boat is placed on top, creating a kind of capsule over the body with the extremities dangling outside. Once the victim was properly fastened between the two boats, they wouldn't be able to move, and so they would be stuck in this position for the entirety of the execution, which, let's not forget in Mithridates' case, was 17 days. Now, here's where things get nasty. We're going to quote the Greek historian Plutarch, who covers the process in quite some detail. So, setting them together that the head, hands and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of the body lies shut up within, they then proceed by forcing him to ingest a mixture of milk and honey before pouring all over his face and body. And it's the milk and honey that turned this from a simple case of death by starvation, dehydration or exposure into something absolutely grotesque. You see, milk and honey are extremely rich foods, which means that a small amount can keep someone alive for a pretty long time, and when consumed in abundance can lead to diarrhea and nausea. Of course, to borrow Shakespeare's words, the sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. In other words, this would quickly become a very unpleasant thing to have to consume, and the sources tell us that before long the victims would have trouble actually keeping this mixture down, to quote Plutarch again. They gave him this food, and if he refused to eat, they forced it down his throat by prying open his mouth with reeds. And again, they would absolutely stuff the victim with so much of this that the victim would become nauseous and their belly would swell with milk and honey. Now, you might be thinking, that's actually not that bad, being force-fed until you die, but trust me, it's about to get so much worse. Once the victim had been fed, that same mixture would then be poured onto the hands, feet and face, meaning that those exposed limbs would begin to attract all manner of insects, flies, wasps, bees and even some nastier stuff we'll get into later. You can imagine the discomfort of having sweet milk and sticky honey slowly harden and bake onto your skin in the punishing heat as you laid on your back under the brutal Persian sun. The 12th century chronicler Zonaras also details the process, and again, to quote him, "This is repeated every day, the effect being that flies, wasps and bees, attracted by the sweetness, settle on his face and all such parts of him as project outside the boats, and miserably torment and sting the wretched man." So, at this stage, the victim is being force-fed milk and honey, and his hands, feet and face are crawling with all manner of creepy crawlies. And yeah, it's unpleasant stuff, but it's not really a worst death in history caliber of suffering. And that's all about to change once we take a look at what's happening inside the boats. Now, remember, the victim is strapped between the two boats and unable to move, which means that when it's time for all of this indulgent grub to come back out, it all ends up inside the boat that you are strapped into whilst laying on your back, essentially turning the whole thing into a septic tank with you inside. And since the victim's diet is just milk and honey, the waste they produce would be abundant, watery, and absolutely stinking as it hotboxes in the 40-degree Persian sun. Plutarch tells us that in the case of Mithridates, this is more or less exactly how things went down. Quote, "Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed." For those who didn't quite catch Plutarch's rather vague language, he's telling us that the conditions inside the boat, which let's not forget are basically a septic tank by now, are absolutely perfect for all kinds of insects and infections to breed like crazy. And that's what kills him. Slowly though, let's remember Mithridates lasts 17 days. Plutarch doesn't actually specify what any of these creeping things and vermin are, but with modern day knowledge we can take a pretty good guess at what exactly would be going down within the boats. See, first you've got open wounds, raw or exposed flesh, and an abundance of feces or urine. Then you've got the constant feeding and the residue of this milk and honey, which causes fermentation and attracts more pests and insects. Zonaras mentions that the stomach itself becomes distended, which basically just means bloated, and on top of all that, you've got no movement within the boats, nor any circulation of fresh air within. So it all starts to kind of rot and decompose as the whole display is left to bake in the sun. To quote Zonaras again, "His belly, distended as it is with milk and honey, throws off liquid excrements, and these putrefying breed swarms of worms, intestinal, and of all sorts." He would have, quite literally, been eaten alive in slow motion from the inside out and from the outside in. And although it was his fellow man who put Mithridates in this position, it would be nature herself that would do the hard lifting. Flesh flies and blowflies would have been first to arrive, attracted by the smell of rotting flesh. These would lay eggs in the open wounds and in the excrement, which would later hatch into maggots. As an interesting side note, modern forensic entomology actually uses these specific types of fly to be able to determine an estimated time of death for corpses. Anyway, these eggs would then hatch as maggots, which would eat through everything they could, and would of course be everywhere. In the mouth, the nose, the ears, the orifices of the body that were within the boats, and any open wounds, and they would also likely be floating around in the slush that was gathering within the chamber. Modern studies show that some maggots can eat through the skin and muscle all the way down to the bone within just days, if given the right conditions. Next up would be ants and beetles, which, like the flies, will be attracted to the smell of decomposing flesh and will be able to do their work on any part of the body softer than bone, stripping away cartilage and fat with ease and entering the body through any available orifice, be that an opening in the flesh or any of the body's pre-existing entry points. Of course, on top of all this, outside of the boats, Mithridates would be constantly bothered by midges, mosquitoes, wasps and bees, all of which attracted by the sight of a free meal, be it in the form of blood or honey. And then, of course, what the historical sources aren't able to describe, because they didn't have the medical knowledge at the time, was the damage done by bacterial infection and internal decay, causing even more bloating, the liquefaction of organs into mush, and the early stages of sepsis, which again would attract even more insects and maggots in a vicious cycle of decomposition and rot. Blowflies laid eggs in his wounds, maggots chewed through his flesh, carrion beetles burrow beneath his skin, and his own gut bacteria, freed by infection, began to digest him from the inside. And it was that would finally kill the victim after day upon day upon day of the forced feeding, the hot sun, and an ever-increasing number of insects and other putrid events. The victim would slowly rot and be eaten, turning from a man into a liquid mess by the end. To quote Plutarch again, "When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon and, as it were, growing to his inwards. In this way Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired." Now, when I was first reading about this, my first thought was that why didn't the victim just try and rock the boat in order to try and flip the chamber over, causing a much faster death by drowning? After all, these boats would have had to have been relatively small if they allowed for your limbs and your head to stick out of the sides, so it must have been possible to flip them. And this is where I think we might be getting the boats wrong. See, in all of the pictures I've been able to find, the boats are left on the water, giving the impression that the entire time the victim was floating. But I don't think this is accurate. None of the historical sources mention that the boat was floating. It's not in Plutarch's description, and it's not in Xenarus's either. My guess is that the boats were probably placed in a small ditch or hole in the earth, so that no matter how hard the victim thrashed, their fate was inevitable. Plus, if the boats were to be on land, not the water, then it stands to reason that it wouldn't just be flies and maggots that could get to the victim, but also rats and ants' nests, which could work their way through whatever took their fancy. Now, before you go to bed with too many nightmares, there's actually some pretty convincing arguments to be made that Scaphism, that is the death by boats we just covered and the death of Mithridates, may have actually never happened. See, Xenarus's description is thought to come from the Greek historian Ctesias, who has a reputation for exaggerating and sometimes just making things up about people he didn't like, and the Persians were one of those groups he might have wanted to paint as especially cruel and violent. Again, Plutarch, the main source that we have, is also writing this about 500 years after it all went down, and he also was not above the odd exaggeration when it suited him to paint a picture in the reader's mind. There's also no archaeological evidence of the boats, no carvings, no illustrations, no grave sites. There's also no records at all of its use. And the Persians left behind plenty of stories about mass crucifixions, impalements, beheadings and so on. They weren't at all shy about being nasty when they wanted to be, and a punishment as brutal as Scaphism would probably be done to send a message, and so it seems unusual to me that they go through all this cruelty just to send a message and then not actually record that message. In fact, Scaphism may be more Greek than Persian. See, the word Scaphism actually comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning trough or boat. So, if the Greeks didn't get the idea from the Persians, who did they get it from? And the answer to that question is themselves. You see, there's a close cousin of Scaphism, another brutal form of torture involving a controlled rotting of the victim called siphonism, which had been practiced in Greece for quite some time, and the process involves tying someone to a stake, slathering them with honey, and leaving them for the insects and pests to pick apart. Sometimes the victim would be allowed to go alive after a day or two. Sometimes they'd be put out of their misery after a sufficient period of time by being taken off this stake and thrown over a cliff. And then, of course, if they'd been really naughty, sometimes they'd be left to go and rot all of the way. And perhaps, just perhaps, Scaphism was actually the brainchild of a Greek mind, taking this already horrifying punishment to its absolute worst extremes. Either way, it's all pretty grim stuff. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing or supporting us on Patreon. It really, really helps. A massive thanks to those of you that are already there. Cheers!